Welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by Rebecca Clancy, a production coordinator for the film entertainment industry. Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Glad to be here, Sophie. I'm so excited.
Well, I am too. So, here's how this works. Rebecca will have 3 minutes to talk about something that she loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concert, activity, anything she wants. Our only requirement is that she loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, Rebecca?
As ready as I'll ever be.
All right. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so fricking much?
I love Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but I need to clarify it. The tragic events that happened at Pompeii are not what I love about what happened. So let me just get that out of the way first. So I have a background in Latin and Roman history. I actually took Latin for 9 years, including courses in college geared towards art and archaeology of ancient Italy and ancient Greece. So that's a little bit of my background. And when you're in a certain part of the educational world, you usually hit on topics a number of times. So the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was something that no matter what class I ended up in, either we were translating stories about it, we were reading information about it, we were creating fake newspapers about it. So it's something that constantly saw it everywhere that we went. So Mount Vesuvius is super, super cool because it was really my first interaction with any sort of volcanic mindset at all. Volcanoes are really, really super cool. And when I was in 7th grade, I actually got to go to Pompeii specifically to see all of the remains of the eruption that happened. And I got to climb to the top of Mount Vesuvius with my family. So this is a very personal story that means a lot to me. So Pompeii is really cool. Obviously, it's what we know about ancient history at that time because everything was preserved in ash. But a lot of times people don't realize that there were other cities in that area that were affected. Another huge one that was affected was actually a city called Herculaneum, which was to the west of Vesuvius versus Pompeii, which was to the southeast. So when all of the eruptions started happening about 1 p.m. as of October 17th is the current date they're going with in 79 AD, all of the ash from the first eruption started going towards Pompeii. So they were rained. There were rocks and volcanic material that were raining on them for about 18 hours. But Herculaneum, in my personal opinion, got it so much worse because they didn't have that initial issue with all of the volcanic ash coming towards them. So people in Pompeii started to evacuate. People in Herculaneum also started to evacuate. But with them specifically, what really messed with them is the pyroclastic surges that happened. So volcanoes have this event that happens, pyroclastic surges, and for this specific eruption, it was 6 different pyroclastic surges that hit the area. So people in Pompeii were primarily hit with flying debris, and that's the bodies that we see nowadays whenever they're uncovering things in Pompeii. But with Herculaneum, they found, I think, 300 bodies in the boathouse because people were trying to evacuate, but by that point, they were too late, and all of the heat and tectonic plate movement was pushing the waves back to them, so they couldn't evacuate, and they ended up being basically boiled alive because the pyroclastic flow was 480 degrees Fahrenheit at least.
All right. Thank you for telling us about Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius today.
Yay! It's hard to contain myself to 3 minutes, I'll say that. But
well, you did a great job, and now we get to talk more about it.
Thank you. Excellent.
It's been a while since I've been in college, but I would notice that sometimes when there were certain topics that were just so significant that they ended up coming up in multiple different classes, often across majors and things like that. It's Pompeii and Vesuvius is one of those topics that permeated history and literature and a lot of your classes.
Mm-hmm. Yep, strange enough, especially even coming from theater and entertainment. I don't know how, but we always ended up talking about stories, and there's one story that just, like you said, permeates it. It's always pretty much everyone does. I think it's probably just because of the recent discoveries that continuously happen. They even had a discovery that was this past December of basically their version of Chipotle, which was really cool.
Of Chipotle?
So, yep, which I was working in Epcot's Italy Pavilion at the time. So that was insane. And we talked about it constantly because it's just we get such an insight into what was happening at that time just because it's like someone took a snapshot and just froze it for 2,000 years, which is really cool.
Talk a little more about that. We've found one of their restaurants. What other stuff have we discovered in this snapshot of history?
one of the things that's not really talked about in terms of stuff that they've found is that when you think of Latin as a language, which obviously I have experience with, everyone thinks of like the classics or some of the literary experts like Ovid or different authors like that. But what we really found with Pompeii specifically is the vulgar Latin that's never touched on.
Ooh.
So Pompeii is really well known for its graffiti. And it's just cool to see even back then, like, you know, Gaius was here, or, you know, I'm trying to think of like Cornelius, you know, sucks eggs, or that, like that equivalent. I'll keep it kinder language here, but just imagine like that sort of, it's so funny to think, you know, when I'm in middle school and my friend's writing on my desk, like, Olya was here. I'm like, that's basically the equivalent to what we're finding now, except it was just frozen in time.
People have always been people.
Yeah, it's this, we think of these ancient societies as so far away from what we do, but they are so astoundingly similar to how we think now. Like, people are people no matter what happens, like you were saying.
What was it like to be there? You mentioned that you visited with your family.
Yes. So I actually visited, this is the one thing I regret about it, is that I was only about year 2.5 of my 9-year journey in Latin. Which I was very fortunate to go on with my Latin class. But being in Pompeii is so unreal because, like I said, you've heard about it all the time. I had heard about it many times up until that point. And it's so weird to be walking on like cobblestones that people walked on 2,000 years ago. Being from the United States, we don't really have a lot of experience with our architecture before, you know, it's 1776. We don't have a lot of older buildings that we can really have that sort of experience with. But there was just something so peaceful about it, which is the most ironic thing, given that in the distance there's this ginormous volcano that completely devastated the town. But unfortunately, even though that apocalyptic-esque event happened, now it gives us a great insight into culture and arts at that time too.
From the way you described the eruption of this volcano and its effects, it sounds like you know quite a bit about the way that volcanoes erupt, just in general. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I'm someone who, when I have a fear of something, I like to put information to it because it makes me feel better. It's like listening to true crime podcasts or different things like that. You know, it's like mental preparation for events that will never happen. I was terrified when we were at Vesuvius that somehow, some way, even though it hadn't erupted in, you know, it was going to erupt while I was there. Would that happen? Absolutely not. But I was terrified at the time that it would. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about it once we left, because they kept saying, you know, things like earthquakes can set off volcanoes, especially if they're still active. So I wanted to figure out what went into it. And after really seeing the volcano in person and being able to go up to the top of it, I started watching like disaster movies and things. One of my favorite movies is Dante's Peak, which is about a volcanic eruption happening in Washington. It was so fascinating. And I wanted to figure out, you know, on the off chance I happen to live around a volcano, I want to know kind of what are the signs of it going to erupt. And it's really cool, the detection systems that they have in place. Like at the time of Vesuvius erupting, it was about like, let's call it 60,000 people lived in the general vicinity of the volcano. And you saw how terribly that went. And right now there's around 2 million people living at that, like around the volcano in the Bay of Naples. It's one of the most densely populated areas in Italy. And I had to know, okay, what are their plans in place? Because obviously, if this happens again, the original event happened and it was over in 2 days. How are you going to evacuate 2 million people? And they actually have, assuming 20 days notice, based on all of the different things they have in place, because they're monitored actively by the, I'm going to butcher this because it's in Italian, but basically like they have an observatory that's in Naples, that's for Vesuvius, and they have extensive networks of seismic and gravimetric, let's call it stations. So it uses like radar and chemical analysis of the gases emitted from the volcano to give them that sense of time. So assuming they have 20 days, there's like a 7-day evacuation plan in place right now that would evacuate around 600,000 people from the red zone, which would be like the most affected. But that's, you know, everything goes according to plan. And we have extensive time for this. I just find it so fascinating, like what plans are in place. And especially here in the States, we have like Mount St. Helens and all of the devastation that came from that. So it's just really cool learning about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's nice to know that people are out there, learning from the disasters of the past and figuring out how to make sure that if it does happen again, as many people as possible will be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always the goal, is learning from mistakes of the past.
Yeah, a lot of the time on this podcast, I like to ask if there's anything you don't like about the topic. I think it's probably about as obvious as can be what there is to not like about massive disasters and volcanic eruptions. So, does it really help to think about all of these details that, all the details of how it works and all the horrible things that happen during a volcano and what we're doing to reduce those impacts?
Yes, I think knowledge is power. That's what I'll always say. And especially with these sort of apocalyptic type events or these natural disasters, it's so terrible that they happen, but there's so much to learn, especially with Pompeii and Vesuvius and all of that. Now we have this snapshot or this window into what life was like 2,000 years ago. And then not only that, but things underneath the city that were there since it originally was founded. So we have more than just 2,000 years ago, which we wouldn't have had probably. We wouldn't have as much information as we do because that event happened. Of course, it's a tragedy, which what made me feel better when even brushing up on this knowledge recently, so I had my fun buzzwords, was how many people actually were evacuated from the original disaster, which is what I always like to think about. So they had, like I said, 60,000 people at the time. Realistically, so far, they've only thought about 3,000 people died from it, which is
wow.
Still terrible, but it makes me feel better because I don't know if you've ever had experience with people ignoring people who are experts in scientific type ways. But at the time, at least for Vesuvius, they had recently celebrated like a Vulcan festival for the god of the volcanoes. So whenever they felt the earthquakes and the tremblings that now we know to be associated with volcanic eruptions, they just thought they were getting praise from the god. And they thought that was really exciting. So when the first funnel of ash and everything came out of the volcano, a lot of people started to evacuate, but other people who stayed were the ones who were like, oh, it's not going to be that bad. It'll be fine. Like, it's not a huge deal. And there came a point in the disaster where if you had not evacuated, you were not going to evacuate, which is what we saw with the all of the skeletal remains that they found in Herculaneum.
Mm-hmm. But a community of 60,000 and they've only found like 3,000 people died there. That does sound pretty amazing.
There are so many stories. I highly recommend, if anyone has more interest in it, to check out Pliny the Younger. He's one of the natural historians that actually has the record of what happened at Vesuvius, because his uncle, Pliny the Elder, was a famous natural historian that actually died trying to rescue people from the base of the volcano. They have a lot more information as to what was going on at the time and how evacuation efforts were going and how the Roman naval officers were trying to evacuate people. So it's just fascinating what transpired. And there's also, I was watching recently, with all of the pre-visualization technology that they have nowadays, there's actually like a simulation of the events in real time that you can watch, which is so cool.
Rebecca, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it at any point.
And I'm happy to listen. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, or our guest, Rebecca, you can find her social media information in the episode description. And don't forget to use the hashtag #LoveThisThingCast to tell us about the things you love. I Love This Thing So Fricking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU The Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.